Hello and welcome to today's National HoUSed campaign call. I'm Sarah Sadie and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. I want to welcome everybody to today's call. We're going to give it a minute or so for folks to join on the line, and then we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm just going to wait for one moment and then we'll go ahead. Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's National HoUSed campaign call. I'm Sarah Sadie and I'm the Senior Vice President of Policy and Field Organizing with the National Low Income Housing Coalition. It's good to see everybody. I'm going to invite all of you to enter your name, your organization, your location in the chat box so we know where everybody is calling in from. And remember that you can add your questions for all of our speakers in the Q&A box. So for all of you, this is our National HoUSed campaign call. We launched this campaign to focus on advancing anti-racist policies and achieving the large-scale and sustained investments that are needed to ensure that renters with the lowest incomes have an affordable, accessible place to call home. We launched this campaign because we recognize that more than ever, we needed bold policies to ensure that people with the lowest incomes and those who are the most marginalized have a stable place to call home. On our call, we have from across the country advocates, including homeless service and shelter providers, housing providers, housing advocates, resident organizers, people with lived experience, including renters and people experiencing homelessness. We have philanthropy and maybe even media on the line. We have a great call ahead of us today. We're going to hear updates from our partners at Upturn about how advocates can support federal renter protections. We're going to learn more about land use reforms and housing costs, both big topics that have been in the news a lot recently. And we'll get a field update from Minnesota, as well as the latest on Capitol Hill. There's a lot of drama unfolding right now, so there's a lot to talk about. Before we get into the agenda, though, I just want to remind folks, yes, you can ask questions in the Q&A box. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, but that's a great place for us to be able to sort through them and figure out which ones that we'll be asking. And then also for folks who are interested, we'll share a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, any of the materials that our speakers address in the coming days. Before we get started with our speakers, though, I do want to just spend a moment or two addressing the recent murder of Jordan Neely, a person who is experiencing homelessness in New York City. At the coalition, I know that I speak for all of our staff to say that we are just horrified and outraged at this tragic killing. We're keeping his family and loved ones in our thoughts, and we are demanding justice for his killer. We have talked for many years about the harmful consequences that come from this constant dehumanization and vilification of people who are experiencing homelessness. The killing is the result of that dangerous rhetoric from people like Donald Trump, Robert Marbut, the Cicero Institute, Michael Schellenberger, Mayor Adams, and others, including many policymakers who are wrongly conflating homelessness and crime, who are condoning encampment sweeps, quote unquote, or raids without providing safe alternatives, and who are criminalizing people for not having a home. It's really important right now for all of us to remember that, in fact, despite the rhetoric that we hear from those policymakers, that people who are homeless are much more likely to be the victims of crime rather than the perpetrators of it. And we also have to recognize that we are seeing this huge backlash against proven solutions to homelessness and against people who are experiencing it. And that growing trend is just increasing in many of our communities, and that we have to recommit ourselves to working to turn things around and to build support for the evidence-based best practices that we know work to end homelessness and recognize the dignity of people who are experiencing it. So I want to invite you all to think about joining our monthly webinar series on homelessness and housing first, which we co-host with the National Alliance to End Homelessness and the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. We've had about 11,000 people register for the series, and I think that's because we're seeing these threats to people experiencing homelessness, and all of us are looking for ways that we can be part of the solution. So my colleague Elena shared in the chat box a link to that webinar series, and I encourage you guys to check it out. We're going to switch gears now, and we can turn to our first speakers, who are going to talk about ways that advocates on this call can be weighing in with federal agencies in support of better tenant screening practices. So I'm going to turn it over to Natasha Duarte and Mariah De Leon from Upturn.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natasha Duarte. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a project director at Upturn. And just quickly for folks who aren't familiar with Upturn, we're a small nonprofit. We do research to understand how technology impacts racial and economic justice and how it mitigates people's access to basic needs like housing and jobs and credit. So we work on other areas like policing and public access to public benefits. Mariah and I work on our housing project, and we've been focused on understanding how tenant screening, and particularly the records that are used to screen tenants, perpetuate housing injustice and insecurity. And I should say, so once we do research to sort of understand these problems, and we do advocacy to push for broader structural change beyond just the technology, because the technology is usually just an extension of the problem and not the root of the problem. So today we're going to talk to you about an opportunity to influence federal policy on tenant screening. And so to get started, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Mariah to introduce herself and give an overview of this comment opportunity.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mariah, and I am a research associate at Upturn. And I'm going to start by giving you all a little bit of background on the tenant screening request for information and the two agencies behind it. Next slide, please. So in January of this year, the White House announced a plan to increase fairness in the rental market and further principles of fair housing, and they called it the Blueprint for a Renter's Bill of Rights. And the Renters' Bill of Rights was primarily a result of federal advocacy led by the Homes Guarantee Campaign in collaboration with a lot of other policy advocates. And this is really significant in that it's one of the first moments in which the federal government has acknowledged the needs of renters. So it signifies an important step forward for federal tenant protections. And among many other top-level actions, part of the blueprint announced that the FTC and CFPB would begin trying to identify any unfair practices that prevent applicants and tenants from accessing and staying in secure housing. And the CFPB also announced that it will issue guidance and coordinate with the FTC in various enforcement efforts to ensure accuracy in the credit reporting system, and also hold background check companies accountable for their procedures. Next slide, please. So in order to inform any future guidance and enforcement actions, the FTC and CFPB are asking the public to comment on their experiences with background screening, especially as it relates to criminal and eviction records, tenant screening algorithms, and any discriminatory impacts that are felt by marginalized communities. Next slide, please. So in terms of authority, the FTC enforces against unfair or deceptive business practices. The FTC is also the primary authority on the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which means that it enforces rules to ensure accuracy in credit reporting, which includes the tenant screening industry. For example, in the past, they have fined the tenant screening company known as Appfolio for including criminal and eviction records in tenant screening reports without checking to make sure that they were matched to the right person and didn't contain any errors, which does not comply with existing reasonable accuracy standards under FCRA. And the CFPB also has the authority to regulate background check companies, which includes tenant screening companies. It can use its authority to tell background check companies which practices do or do not meet their legal obligations. And the CFPB has issued a lot of pieces of guidance in the past couple of years. And this includes guidance that indicates that name-only matching, which is the practice of using only a first or last name to match a consumer with a record, does not satisfy existing legal requirements for background check companies. Next slide, please. And so the FTC and CFPB are looking for comments from all stakeholders in the tenant screening process. So not just tenants and tenant advocates, but also landlords and tenant screening companies. And both federal agencies are looking for information that would help explain how tenant screening works and also how it impacts people that are looking for rental housing. This can be information that tenants receive about being screened, such as screening criteria that's being used against them, or if they're ever told the reasoning behind a rejection. It can also include information about how landlords evaluate criminal and eviction records throughout their screening processes. And it also, any information about the discriminatory impacts of tenant screening felt by tenants is also valuable. Next slide, please. So the FTC and CFPB can take a couple of different actions following the RFI. First, they can sue and enforce against tenant screening companies and landlords who they find to engage in unfair, deceptive, or discriminatory practices. And this can include rejecting an applicant based on an eviction filing or arrest record, or even failing to disclose why an applicant is rejected in the first place. As mentioned before, the CFPB has issued guidance on tenant screening before. And so both the CFPB and FTC can issue more guidance or promulgate rules that require tenant screening companies and landlords to take specific steps to protect tenants. This can be excluding certain records like sealed or dismissed eviction records from tenant screening reports, or notifying tenants of which information will be used to screen them. And it is also possible that either the FTC or CFPB will conduct follow-up studies or investigations in order to gain more targeted information from landlords and tenant screening companies. For example, they can investigate for more information on how tenant screening companies design and test their scoring algorithms, which is often not publicly available information. And they can also share any information that they get from the RFI with other federal agencies, such as HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, to aid in their own enforcement efforts against housing discrimination in the tenant screening process. So as you can see, the FTC and CFPB can take a lot of different actions from this RFI, which really underscores the importance of tenants and tenant advocates submitting comments. And now I'll pass it to Natasha, who will walk you all through how to submit a comment on our website.
Thanks, Mariah. Okay, so we worked together with two other organizations, PolicyLink and People's Tech Project, to try to make it a little easier for people who are impacted by tenant screening to submit a comment in this process. You could go to the official federal website, regulations.gov, and submit a comment. That's totally fine. It's a little bit harder to navigate. So we put together this website, stoptenantscreening.org. And what we tried to do is put all of the key information for renters and other impacted people about this request for information and a form on the website that submits comments directly to regulations.gov. So all those comments go directly to that federal website. So it has the same impact as going directly there. So the next few slides will be screenshots that I'll show you from this website. Again, it's stoptenantscreening.org, which is also helpfully in the chat now. So what the website does is just give a brief overview of the importance of this RFI. So basically the information that Mariah was just sharing, what it is, how it will lead to enforcement and policy making, and the types of information that the government is, or that would be helpful for impacted people to talk about. Next slide, please. And so as you can see, on one side of the page, there's this information. You can also download the RFI from this website and see all of the questions that the government is asking. And then on the other side of the page is the form to submit a comment, and that comment will go directly to the federal agencies. And I think what's important to know about submitting a comment is that it does not have to take a particular form or be, formal or polished or organized in a certain way. It's just really important for people who have a story to tell, whether they are someone who's been searching for housing, who's been, screened out of housing opportunities, or a community organization or direct service provider or organizer that that helps people find housing and has a story to tell about the impacts of tenant screening. It's just really important that people share that with the agencies, because we know that, the industry is going to be filing comments, and this is going to inform the policy that comes out of these agencies. And it also provides an important basis, like a legal and factual basis that the agency can use to support its enforcement against unfair and discriminatory tenant screening practices. Next slide. So we have and you don't see it all here. This is just a screenshot of part of the website. But we have a sort of non-exhaustive list of examples of the types of information that particularly renters, people searching for housing, people experiencing homelessness are in the best position to talk about to the agencies. And so there's sort of a list of examples of types of information that might be useful to provide. And then you can also see here more of the form. The form, whether you go to regulations.gov or you use this website, will ask you to share information about yourself. You can choose to submit comments anonymously, so they won't show up with your name next to them. If you do include your name, then your name will show up next to your comment in the public record. So just be aware of that. Totally fine to submit anonymous comments. And then we also we warn about this on the website, but just tell your story, but leave out sensitive personal information, like your address. Obviously don't share your social security number or any other details that you do not want to be publicly accessible. Next slide. And then this is just some additional resources. We'll share the slides, folks will be sharing all of these slides later, so you'll have this. We also did a webinar on this with PolicyLink. PolicyLink hosted a webinar last week. So I'll share the link to that in the chat. We talk just a little bit more in depth about the problems with tenant screening, which we don't have time to go into all of it today, but that might also be helpful for folks who want a little bit more grounding and information to support or help them submit comments and sort of understand where all this is coming from. So yeah, again, that's stoptenantscreening.org. And we are also happy to have folks reach out to us if we can be supportive in other ways for getting people's stories into the record for this federal comment process. So with that, I will stop and happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Natasha and Mariah. I'm so glad you're able to join on, because I think this is a really, concrete action that people can take. They can do that today after today's webinar by going to the website stoptenantscreening.org. And I checked out the website. It looks really great. Really great work there. I was wondering, could you just share a little bit more about how easy this process is for people with lived experience to participate? I know that, when I hear things like Federal Register and regulations and submitting comments, I'm intimidated. It sounds like a lot of heavy lifting, but maybe you can just drill home a little bit more about how easy it is for renters to be able to share their story.
Yeah, so in this process, the government is actually required to read and consider every comment that's submitted. regardless of the form it takes or who it comes from or what it says. So the comments that people take the time to submit here, they're going to get read. So that's the first thing. They're going to get read by the federal agencies that oversee what tenant screening companies do and how landlords use tenant screening reports. And that's really important. It's a really important opportunity for people to just share their experiences and what the knowledge that they have, which that lived experience is so valuable, to make these regulators understand like what are the real human impacts of tenant screening, of the processes that landlords and these companies use to oftentimes, lock people out of housing because they have a criminal record in their history or an eviction record or just low income or even in some cases because they're using a voucher, which, proves that they can pay rent. So again, comments don't have to take any kind of particular form. You can just start writing your story, your experiences. If you've been impacted by tenant screening, like you have knowledge to share, and it doesn't matter how you say it. There's no particular length that you need to write for. You could write a paragraph. You could write many paragraphs if you want to. So yeah, and with this website, we try to make it as easy as possible. You go to the website, you type in your comment, you hit submit. So yeah, any amount of time and capacity that folks have, however little or however much, is totally fine and good. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did see a question from Alexa, who's asking, did I hear correctly that tenant screening is being done by algorithms in some places? I've heard of this being done by law enforcement, and it was arguable that the algorithm was racial profiling because of the data that was going into some of the algorithms.
Yeah, so I can talk about a couple of ways that algorithms impact the tenant screening process, but I want to be careful and make sure people know that just because we're using the word algorithm does not mean that we're talking about like sophisticated or complex or fancy technology. It's just that certain aspects of tenant screening have been automated by computers. And ultimately, most of the time, as far as we can tell from what these tenant screening companies are sharing publicly, and what we're hearing from people like folks on this call, direct services providers and renters, tenant screening is still largely reliant on criminal, eviction, credit histories, income, rent income ratio. So it's not necessarily introducing new information into the process. But a couple ways algorithms show up. First is just the process of matching so when people fill out a housing application, they provide some personal information like their name and address, and maybe their social security number. And then when that landlord that they're applying to uses a tenant screening company to get a background check, the tenant screening company uses that personal information to try to match people with records from various public and private sources like court records and credit files from like Experian and Equifax, the big credit bureaus, as well as like all kinds of other databases that they might purchase access to. And so there is an automated process or an algorithm that they use to, and it's, not that different from just like Googling something and looking for results that match the information that you're Googling, right? They're looking for records that might be under the same name and address, or, other combinations of that information. Which notoriously leads to like lots of errors and problems with the information that gets surfaced. In some cases, it seems that companies may be automatically including those matched records in tenant screening reports without doing any manual checking to make sure that they actually match the right person, or to check and see if, a case was dismissed or actually should be sealed or is very old. So there is often a computer that is finding those matches and then it automatically including them in tenant screening reports. It seems like from what we can tell. There's of course a lot we don't know that the companies just haven't shared publicly. The other place that algorithms can show up is you may have seen some examples of tenant screening reports where they don't just show the information that the company has found about a person, but also like a 3-digit score that might look like a credit score or some sort of recommendation to either accept or reject the rental applicant. Those recommendations or scores can be created by algorithms through like an automated process. So in that case, the company may be coming up with a formula. Like it may be as simple as if the tenant has an eviction record, then recommend to reject them. Or if a certain type of criminal record, then recommend to reject them. Or it could be a formula like, they take the person's credit score, whether they have an eviction record or a criminal record, and their rent to income ratio, and they just make a mathematical formula that will then spit out some 3-digit score that is a calculation based on all of those things. And so they are using these types of algorithms and these features in tenant screening reports to get landlords or encourage landlords to rely more and more on what's in the report, and the way that the tenant screening company is interpreting the information rather than the landlord like making their own analysis. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't necessarily mean, again, that there's anything really new influencing those recommendations other than the stuff that we all kind of know is keeping people out of housing, again, criminal credit and eviction histories, and information about income.
Thank you for that, Natasha, and thank you, Mariah, for joining. We don't have time to get to other questions, but if you're able to stay on, I do see that there are some questions in the Q&A box, and I hope you're able to stay on a little bit. Okay, moving along, we're going to talk about land use reforms and how it relates to housing costs. And we're going to hear from Chris Davis from the Urban Institute. Chris?
Yes, I'm Christopher Davis, data scientist at the Urban Institute. Thank you all for having us today. I am here to discuss a recent study we conducted at the Urban Institute concerning the impact of land use reforms on housing affordability. Next slide. And so some context for this, as we all know, this is why we're all here. The US is facing a housing affordability crisis where too many folks are paying a high percentage of their income on housing, which is exacerbating existing economic and racial inequities. And one potential explanation for that, of why housing costs are so high, is overly restrictive land use regulations that limit the supply of housing. As demand has increased in many areas over the past few decades, the supply of affordable housing has dropped, and some argue that lifting those restrictions that affect the number of housing units that could be built in an area would be a low-cost option to increase the supply of housing and thereby lower rents for folks. It is unclear, though, in practice, if the loosening of restrictions has had a great impact on affordable housing supply. For example, reforms may happen in places that already approve variations systematically, so it's already happening. And so the change in the actual regulation isn't that big of a deal on the ground because they're de facto already doing what the regulation has put forth. Builders may also be converting lower cost existing units into higher cost ones, which could lead obviously to higher prices for those buildings but could also be causing amenity effects, which to increase the surrounding housing values as well. In other words, so new buildings being built may make a neighborhood seem nicer to folks, and that would raise the property values in that area. And so that could be one reason why loosening restrictions may not have the expected effect. Next slide. And so to better understand these issues, we undertook the first cross-city panel analysis of the impact of land use reforms on housing supply and rents. So one of the big issues in this space is there's not a great systematic data set about when and where specific land use reforms have happened across multiple cities and local entities. And we need that data in order to estimate the impact of those reforms on the outcomes that we care about, including housing supply and rents. And so to remedy that problem, we use machine learning algorithms to search newspaper articles in the United States across 1,136 cities and 8 metro areas between 2000 and 2019 in order to identify the location, date, and type of land use reforms that exist or that were enacted at specific points in time. We also identified reforms as ones that would be more restrictive to building units or less restrictive, because you would imagine that they would have differing impacts on the number of units that are built. And the table to the right here on the slide tabulates our summary of the reforms that we gathered through this method by the type of reform and metropolitan region. We then took that data, that reform data, and we merged it with our outcome data. In this case, it was the number of counts of addresses, the gross rent of a city, and the number of units affordable to households of various levels of income in those cities. With that data, we estimated a fixed effect model with city-specific time trends to examine the relationship between these land use reforms and the supply and price of rental housing. Now, I'm not going to right now spend too much time on the model, although happy to, of course, take questions about it at the end. But in short, basically our fixed effect model attempts to control for any variables that are relatively unchanging about the cities we're examining. So for example, how much land area there is in a specific city. And this allows us to remove large sources of bias in our estimates, otherwise known as omitted variable bias. Moving on to our findings. And this is what we found. We find that reforms that increase land use restrictedness, such as a reform that increases a minimum lot size, say, was associated with a significant $50 increase in median rent over the medium to long term. So that means in general, we find significant evidence to show a relationship between land use reforms that would decrease the ability to build supply, so a more restrictive reform, and rent increases, which is what we expected. And next slide. We also find a reduction in units affordable to middle income renters. So when land use restrictiveness increases, when we put in more restrictions, the supply of units affordable to middle income renters decreased. And this decrease, when we looked at it, only really occurred towards the middle income of the price distribution. We didn't find statistically significant evidence that the additional lower cost units became available, or moderated in cost in the years following reforms. However, impacts are negative here across the affordability spectrum, and we cannot rule out that there are impacts there. We just don't have the power. We don't have the statistical power to say, this is a statistically significant result, that these are having a reduction in number of units. Next slide. So we find, so that all of that was about restrictions, like additional restrictions or more restrictive restrictives. From the opposite side, we find that reforms that loosen restrictions, so make make restrictions that were in place, like we basically loosened them. We go from a place of that where they were more restricted and now they're not as restricted. That's associated with a statistically significant 0.8% increase in the housing supply within 3 to 9 years of the reform. And that's accounting for new and existing stock. So we do see an increase in the number of housing units. Next slide. This increase occurs predominantly for units at the higher end of the rent price distribution. So we find, again, no statistically significant evidence that additional lower cost units become available or moderated in cost in the years following reforms. However, impacts are positive across the affordability spectrum. And so we can't say for certain that that there is no effect here, but we just can't statistically say that there is. We can't rule out that there isn't, but we do think that there is one at the high end of the distribution based on these results. Okay, so overall, that was a lot that I just threw at you. What these results suggest is that these reforms that are loosening restrictions can and have increased housing supply, but that this increase is likely inadequate to increase the availability of housing affordable to low and middle income households in the short term. In this graph on the right here is basically showing that when restrictions were loosened, when there were less restrictive reforms of land use, you see this uptake after the reform. So this is a graph on the x-axis is showing the years before and after a reform is enacted. And on the y-axis is a normalized distribution of the number of addresses. And so we see it kind of goes on a linear trend for the more restrictive reforms, but it increases slightly for the less restrictive reforms. Okay, so what do we recommend based on this data? We think that leaders should consider pairing direct investments in affordable housing, such as immediate investments in public and assisted housing and light-tech developments, with reforms loosening land use restrictions to address both short-term and long-term housing affordability. Basically that we don't think that land use alone should be the answer, that it is definitely a tool that can be used, and especially if cities enact larger land use reforms than they have in the past, it's possible that a much greater impact could be seen. But a lot of what's been done has been incremental, and if folks have local governments that enact bigger changes, we may see bigger results. And two, leaders should consider pairing those changes with direct investments into affordable housing. What can the federal government do? As I said before, one issue that permeates this research is the inability to get comprehensive data on zoning across cities. And that's hurts us as researchers because we're not able to really identify what actually is working and what's not. And so the federal government could require jurisdictions submitting equity plans to describe conditions of zoning codes when it comes to affordable housing availability, pointing out conditions like share of residential land limited to a single family home development, or even better, to require jurisdictions to submit their zoning code in a standardized format so that it can be compared across jurisdiction. The federal government could also provide grants to MPOs to act as a regional zoning plan and data stewards that could collect and maintain standardized regional zoning databases. And now to motivate jurisdictions to relax exclusionary restrictions, so what we actually might want to reduce affordability, the federal government could create funding opportunities across agencies that prioritize or require relaxed zoning regulations and encourage equitable community engagement at the local level that is representative of the community. Right now, at a lot of these, local community engagements, it's a lot of the homeowners that are able to show up, and they're not reaching the people who are the most affected by exclusionary restrictions negatively. And so the more that we can incorporate the people that are more disadvantaged or who are not maybe even have the time or the ability to go to these meetings, the better. And finally, these are just some ideas of what we've heard from affordable housing developers, but what the federal government can do to encourage the development of more immediate affordable housing. I'm not going to go through all of them right now, just for time's sake, but we would love to hear from you all now or through email or eventually. What ideas you may have about how we encourage the development of immediate affordable housing for folks. And I'll just talk about a couple of these right now. So there's people have flagged reducing the 50% tax exempt bond requirement for LIHTC, which would basically attempt to reduce the hardship for getting LIHTC buildings built. And encouraging localities to reduce tap fees for affordable housing, thereby motivating folks to do affordable housing where they otherwise wouldn't. It would basically make it less costly. And so these are a couple of ideas. There's other ideas here. I'm sure there are other ideas that you all have, and we would love to hear from them.
Thank you, Chris, so much for joining. I really appreciate it. I think what's really helpful about your research is that it sort of underscores what many of us in the field have been seeing anecdotally, which is that zoning is a really important piece of the puzzle to solve the housing crisis, but it by itself alone is not enough. So I appreciate that. I'm wondering about some of the reforms you spoke about in terms of how to incentivize better zoning practices. You mentioned tying it to AFFH or affirmatively furthering fair housing standards. But I'm wondering if you're thinking about whether or not that's going to move the needle with those communities that are really dug in and want to keep their restrictive zoning practices. We know that for many of them, I don't think the access to HUD money is necessarily going to be very persuasive to them if they're taking all of these steps to avoid building affordable housing in the first place. So any thoughts about how to incentivize or require or move some of those more dug in communities?
It's a great question. I think the AFFH portion was actually trying to not engage folks to do more affordable housing, but was to get better zoning data, in fact. It was just like a lever that we could use to try to encourage them to standardize their zoning records so we could do research that is better answering this question. As to what other things we can do to affect affordability or what the federal government can do, I think the slides here we've heard from developers are some ideas, but that is an open question. It's one of those things where we want to hear from everybody here. What do we think the federal government can really do to encourage this development?
Wonderful. Well, I'll let folks put in their comments in the chat box for that or in the Q&A box. One more question for you. I really liked how you talked about the need to tie zoning reforms with preservation efforts. I'm wondering if you could share a little bit more about what, if we didn't include preservation in the equation, how would that lead to things like gentrification or displacement?
Yeah, I think part of the issue is that when we are continually just remodeling developments and not remodeling them, but tearing them down and building up new ones and not preserving them, we are often, those units are going to be much more high cost than otherwise. And they're also going to have amenity effects, which in other words, they're going to increase property values around that area as well. And so the more that we can preserve, which is also a lower cost option, the more that we can preserve affordable housing units, the more units that are likely to be available in the current system. And so I think that's one way that we can try to reduce or at least stem the increase of housing costs.
Yeah, especially I'll just say for people with the lowest incomes, if they're seeing their community prices go up, those are the folks who are going to be most impacted by rent increases and most likely to face displacement and other harms. So thank you so much, Chris, for joining with us. I do see a couple more questions in the chat box, and if you're able to stay on, that would be great. But I appreciate you sharing your research with us today.
Sure thing. Thank you.
Absolutely. Now we're going to move on to our field update. We're going to hear from Libby Murphy from Minnesota Housing Partnership. I'm going to turn it over to you, Libby.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for having me. So today is a very exciting day here in Minnesota. In, I don't know, an hour, maybe 2 hours, we are going to pass our housing omnibus bill off of the House of Representatives floor, and then the Senate will take that bill up today. And so today really is the day that Minnesota is going to be investing $1 billion in new resources to housing. This is about an 800% increase to the annual budget at Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. And we're actually seeing more than $1 billion because lawmakers did what seemed impossible, but passed dedicated revenue for affordable housing. So we're going to increase our sales tax in the 7-county metro area here in the Twin Cities and use that to fund housing development in the 7-county metro area and local jurisdictions, and then rental assistance. So it's a very exciting day. And the bill, I won't go into any details about the bill itself because $1 billion, there's a lot to go through there, but it's really funding a continuum of housing from everything from preventing and ending homelessness to investing in manufactured home parks and preserving those and helping residents own and turn their parks into cooperatives. It's reducing racial disparities in home ownership through down payment assistance and the production of new single-family homes, as well as emphasizing production on the most deeply affordable rental homes. Like, I don't know, I'm giddy, so it's kind of hard to focus, but so again, like I said, this is about an 800% increase. Minnesota Housing's annual budget right now is about 125 million. So this biennium, we'll see that $1 billion increase, and then ongoing, we'll see an additional 50 million to Minnesota Housing, plus this dedicated revenue through the metro sales tax, just for the Twin Cities metropolitan area. And to put that into perspective, where we were this time last year, despite having last year an $11+ billion surplus, the housing target was $50 million. And that was a significant increase. I think the previous target before that was $10 million. So we've come a long way, and there's a few reasons for this. One of which is that our surplus has grown to $17.5 billion. We didn't spend any money last year, and so we've let more money accumulate, and so we have a bigger surplus. A lot of that surplus is one time, and hence why we have this large infusion this biennium, and then funding does drop quite significantly, but still above our current biennial allocation to Minnesota Housing, just because fewer of the $17.5 billion is available for ongoing expenses. So we have this huge surplus, and for the first time in a very long time, we have what we're calling a DFL trifecta. So we more often than not, have divided legislature here in the state of Minnesota. And so there's a lot of kind of pent up demand and investments that are being made with this DFL trifecta, kind of unknown what's going to happen in the next election cycle. So they're really trying to pass the most progressive policy and funding agenda as they possibly can get through this legislative session. And the other thing I'd say too is over the past several years, and in the past 3 years in particular, advocates have really changed how they've communicated the need for housing, really started focusing on the overall budget target that's needed to fund affordable housing. So Minnesota Housing Partnership last year started talking about the need for $2 billion in 2022, and then we were talking about $2 billion in 2023. Whereas I began this work almost 9 years ago, we were afraid to ask for more than 30 million, just fearing we would be laughed at by lawmakers going in. And so as advocates have changed that mentality and begun to actually ask make asks that better reflect the need and talk more about dedicated revenue and more ongoing increased spending towards affordable housing. Lawmakers are responding. And then I think also the pandemic has helped us make the case that housing is the foundation and that every other aspect of somebody's life improves when we invest in housing. Trying to think what else. One of the things that's exciting that we did earlier in the session, just maybe 6 weeks back, was we passed 50 million in what was to be used for emergency rental assistance. It's rare and very difficult to pass spending bills before omnibus bill season here. Minnesota, we pass a lot of policy bills, and sometimes if those policy bills might have some funding connected to them, but those are really big caucus priorities. So this was an exception, and part of that was eviction levels are above pre-pandemic levels here in Minnesota, and kind of our new average eviction filing level. We've created a new normal. We don't anticipate going back to our pre-pandemic levels. So that helped make the case to spend the money earlier. And while that money hasn't actually reached individuals yet, it was important to pass that early so that it could get directly allocated to the community partners that are working with families who need that rental assistance. Otherwise, the funding that gets passed tonight, the rest of that funding, we're going to invest an additional 50 million, but the rest of that funding isn't going to be available until September or October. So that was one really important thing that we passed early in session. In addition to all this spending, Minnesota is also going to be updating its tenant protection laws in a number of ways. That is still making its way through conference committee, and so we don't have the final details yet, but we know that a longer notice period for eviction filings, eviction expungement reform are all things that are being tackled. We are working on source of income protections to have a statewide law that is meeting resistance, and looks like it will be the big game changer that doesn't make it through this session. We're still fighting in these last kind of less than 24 hours to get that in the bill, but we've got one senator in our Senate. We have the DFL has a 1-seat majority. And so every vote among the DFL members really does matter. And he's created opposition there. So we'll see if we can be successful in these final hours. I think I'll leave it at that and see if folks have questions about what's happening in Minnesota and how we kind of are at this very exciting moment.
I know. First, I wanted to say congratulations. What a big win for you and for other advocates. It's amazing. And I think it shows to some extent that we have to ask for what we need. You had mentioned before that advocates were always worried about asking for more than the dollar amount that you had been given in past years. So that's really cool to see. And I'm wondering, maybe you could tell us a little bit more about your strategy for advancing this bill in a divided Congress. You mentioned that your legislature is divided. How did you appeal to Republicans in your legislature? How did you try, what messages worked with them? Or what messengers did you use that were better to reach them?
Yeah, so this year, we have a total DFL control for the first time. Up until this point, we have had divided legislatures. So we have been balancing that split, and oftentimes it's been a very close split, but this is the first year in a number of years where we've had the House, the Senate, and the governor's office all controlled by Democrats. And so that is a significant reason for why. Yeah. And we've been able to do things, and these bills will likely be on partisan lines. We did see in the Senate, when it was just $1 billion without a metro sales tax included, we did have 8 Republicans vote in support of that bill. So kind of our housing champions, who are Senate Republicans, were willing to invest in $1 billion in housing. I anticipate now that they've gotten the sales tax through that we won't see Republicans vote in favor because they're taking a stance on no new taxes. We've got this big surplus. We don't need new taxes. But the rest of it, and certainly specific provisions in the bill, especially provisions around homeownership, manufactured housing, have a lot of Republican bipartisan support. Things like rental assistance and deeper affordability have been more partisan here.
Okay, good to know. Well, again, congratulations on your major victory. I do see that there's some questions in the Q&A box. So I'm going to ask you, one, are there any measures that you're hoping the legislature will take up to remedy damage from the past, or are most of them best practices? I'm not exactly sure what that question is getting at, but maybe is it looking to maybe remediate racial segregation? I'm not sure if that's what Dev is asking or not. What's your take on that?
Yeah, so Minnesota has, I don't know where we are this exact moment. We've either been the second or the fifth worst in terms of racial disparities in homeownership. So certainly that has been a focus for lawmakers. It's been a bipartisan effort to address, and it's been a priority for our policy caucus in the legislature. So that is one. We are not really doing any policy this year. We're going to take up zoning reform next year. And all of the comments made about zoning have connected to previous redlining and other exclusionary zoning policies that have segregated communities, because we have very segregated patterns here in the Twin Cities and the state. So that is not a part of the bill. There is a provision in our omnibus bill that directs the finance agency to, and I don't have the exact language in front of me, but to use its resources, to use the $1 billion to address racial disparities. So it will take additional administrative advocacy to work with the agency to figure out what exactly that means and how they're going to use these resources to truly address racial disparities, not just in home ownership, but in things like housing cost burden and homelessness, because those are also very great here.
Thanks for that. I see one quick question from Chastity about, is this bill something that's only going to benefit the metro area, or is this impacting all of the state of Minnesota?
Yep. So the $1 billion, most of that is going to be available statewide, and a lot of the individual provisions, there's language that the agency has to do its best work to ensure kind of a 50-50 divide between the metro area and greater Minnesota. There are some investments that are very specific to greater Minnesota, including infrastructure and workforce market rate, moderate income, rental housing, that are just available to greater Minnesota. They're also going to be doing some things to help balance rental assistance that's going to be funded through the $1 billion appropriations and rental assistance that's going to be funded in the 7-county metro area. The sales tax is just impacting the Twin Cities. Minnesota Housing Partnership is part of the Our Future Starts at Home coalition, which is advancing a constitutional amendment. So this will make that work for a statewide solution for dedicated revenue probably more challenging. We need to navigate this in the next few weeks, but we are committed to finding solutions that are statewide.
Wonderful. Thank you, Libby. I do see a couple more questions in the Q&A box. If you're able to stay on and answer them, that would be great. But congratulations again, and thanks for joining our call. Okay, now we're going to move on to our policy update, and there's a lot here, so I'm going to try to get through as much as we can. But the first thing I wanted to let everyone know is that 2 of our top priority bills for the National HoUSed campaign have been introduced. So it's a major milestone for the campaign, and I want to fill you guys in about what those bills are, where they are now, and how you can help move them forward. The first is the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act. This is a bipartisan bill from Senators Van Hollen from Maryland and Young from Indiana. It's bill number 1257, and it would create 250,000 vouchers for new housing vouchers paired with mobility services to help low-income families with young children move to communities of their choice, including neighborhoods that have good performing or high performing schools and high quality early education and childcare. The bill is really targeted to low-income, high-need families with children under the age of 6 who have a history of homelessness or housing instability, who are living in areas of concentrated poverty, or who are at risk of being pushed out of or displaced from a well-resourced area. And those vouchers are paired with customized counseling and mobility services to help families really understand all of the choices about where they want to live and help them move to a place that best fits their and their family's needs. We had about 60 national organizations endorse the bill when it was introduced, which was great. And what stood out for me is that it was not just folks in the housing sector, but also national organizations from healthcare, child welfare, faith-based organizations, disability justice organizations, and more. So this is a bill that we're super excited about, and we hope you'll help us reach out to senators to ask them to co-sponsor the bill, especially when you talk to your Republican senators. It would be great to have more support on the bill for them for that. The second bill I wanted to mention is the Fair Housing Improvement Act. This is not a bipartisan bill, unfortunately, although it was in the past when Senator Orrin Hatch from Utah was helping to lead the bill. This time it was introduced by Senator Kaine, the senator from Virginia, and Representative Scott Peters from California. And this bill would expand the Fair Housing Act, expand access to housing choice for low-income families by prohibiting discrimination on the basis of source of income, military status, and veteran status by landlords. So we mentioned earlier that some folks mentioned in passing earlier on the call about source of income protections at the state and local level. Many communities have those protections, but there are no protections at the federal level, which mean that about half of all households that have a housing choice voucher are unprotected from this discrimination. I also think what's important about this bill is that it helps to address racial equity and economic mobility, because we know that landlords often discriminate on the basis of source of income instead of or as a proxy for other forms of illegal discrimination, like discrimination based on race or disability status. The bill was introduced with about 70 national organizations, so really strong support there too. And I encourage you, again, talk to your senators and representatives and encourage them to become co-sponsors to the bill. Next slide. Luckily, we had a chance to talk about these bills and other important bipartisan solutions at the Senate Banking Committee hearing at the end of April. Diane, our CEO, President and CEO, was able to testify. She spoke about both of those bills, as well as a whole array of other bipartisan solutions that we support and that we're encouraging Congress to take action on. She made the case for why inaction is costing all of us in the form of higher rents and more housing instability and more homelessness, and that we really need to see Congress take action now, as they did during the pandemic, so that we can save lives, save resources, and provide housing relief to more people. So great news for the House campaign, which you guys are all a part of. Now I want to shift gears a little bit to talk about some of the threats that we're seeing, which are all sort of coming to a head right now. This is a big week this week. President Biden is going to be meeting with the big four, which really means Mitch McConnell, Chuck Schumer, Speaker McCarthy, Hakeem Jeffries, the four leaders of the House and Senate. They are meeting tomorrow. This is not only the first time that they've sat down to talk about or start negotiations around the need to lift the debt ceiling and avoid a default on our nation's debt, but it's the first time that they've met all year, and we're about halfway through the year. So you guys put that together. Right now, it seems like everybody is still in the same place that they were months ago, really holding their line on their initial positions, and there's no deal in sight to lift the debt ceiling. So that means that Democrats are still continuing to say, for the most part, that they don't want to negotiate. They want to lift the debt ceiling through a clean bill without other provisions attached to it. And Republicans, likewise, are really continuing to push for major spending cuts in exchange for lifting the debt ceiling over a short period of time. You might remember, I think we talked about it last time, that House Republicans had passed legislation out of the House that would cap funding for this year, FY24 spending at FY22 levels. And while that doesn't sound like such a big number, in truth, it ends up being about a 23% cut to HUD programs and to other domestic programs, since Republicans also want to exempt defense programs and VA health programs and some others from those budget cuts. And we know that those threats would directly impact people who are already struggling to get by. The HUD secretary has estimated that about 1 million households that are currently receiving rental assistance would lose their rental assistance, and about 120,000 fewer people would be able to be served, who are experiencing homelessness would be able to receive assistance. The bill also puts in place 10 years of spending caps, limiting spending increases to 1% a year for 10 years. It would rescind unobligated COVID relief funding, including state and local fiscal recovery fund dollars and other dollars. And it would put in place work reporting requirements for Medicaid, SNAP, and other safety programs, which we know would likely result in more people who are eligible, but who would lose their assistance because they aren't able to meet those requirements. So we're seeing both sides still really holding firm on what their initial positions have been, even though we are coming very dangerously close to the deadline of when the US could actually default on its debt. So the Treasury expects that that could happen as soon as June 1st, maybe shortly thereafter. It seems increasingly possible that some sort of a default could happen, and that would have really harmful effects for the broader economy. So the next several weeks are going to be incredibly important for advocates to be talking to their members of Congress about why we have to lift the debt ceiling, but more importantly, or just as importantly, that we can't cut funding for programs that are serving struggling households. We can't balance the budget on the backs of those who are already struggling to get by. I do think that there's a couple of possibilities here. I'll just skip ahead to say I'm worried that Democrats are in a position that they might accept deep spending cuts in exchange for lifting the debt ceiling. There's enormous pressure that's being put on, especially Senate moderates, familiar names like Senator Manchin from West Virginia, Senator Sinema from Arizona. I think Republicans think that if they can put pressure on those moderates, that they can force Democrats to the table and sort of force them to be able to accept budget cuts in exchange. Meanwhile, on the Republican side, we're seeing a really coordinated, strong position on their end. This week, we saw 43 Senate Republicans, which is enough to block any legislation from moving forward in the Senate, sign on to a letter saying that they refuse to have any sort of clean debt ceiling lift unless there's, quote, substantive spending and budget reforms. We're also seeing, I think, some moderate Democrats starting to call on the president also to come to the table to accept some budget cuts, and business interests. I think Democrats, there's been reporting that Democrats were anticipating that business interests would call on Republicans to stop playing around with the debt ceiling, but now we're seeing that they're also calling on Democrats to reach some sort of a deal on concessions. And we've mentioned this on previous calls too. We saw this process play out in 2011. It led to 10 years of spending caps that made it impossible for Congress to fund any of these programs at the level that was needed. And so it's really critically important that advocates are weighing in and talking to their members of Congress about what that means. In terms of our messaging and our targets, I'll just say a quick word about that. Our message really is that we cannot push even more people into poverty. We can't take away housing assistance and healthcare from people who need it. And we can't force more people into housing insecurity and homelessness, especially when we're seeing Republicans are thinking also about making permanent, passing permanent legislation or passing legislation to make permanent those big tax cuts that they passed in 2017 for the highest income households and the largest corporations. In terms of targets, I think we have a lot of roles that different advocates can play. When we think about who is going to be at the negotiating table, who are those moderates we need to put pressure on, I encourage you to look at any Democrat who is up for re-election in 2024. We know that Chuck Schumer is going to be listening very closely to what those folks are telling him about how to go forward. And we also want to focus on moderate Republicans in both the House and the Senate, maybe folks who understand the value and importance of federal investments, both in housing and in other spaces as well. But I will say that even if you have a Democrat who doesn't fit this bill or a Republican who doesn't fit this bill, there's still a really important role that you can play. It's important that Senator Chuck Schumer, folks in leadership, President Biden aren't just hearing from those moderates who are feeling the pressure to have concessions on a budget deal. They also need to be hearing from progressive Democrats who are holding the line and telling the rest of their party that we can't accept any cuts, that we shouldn't be imposing any sort of work reporting requirements in exchange for lifting the debt ceiling. So regardless of who your member of Congress is, I want to encourage you to weigh in over the next couple of weeks. In terms of the appropriations bill, I think we're going to start seeing that. Next slide. We're going to start seeing that play out in the next month or so. We're hearing that House Republicans are going to start by marking up those bills that really aren't going to get huge budget cuts. So things like defense, military construction and VA, Homeland Security, those sorts of subcommittees are going to be marked up first, which is a lot easier for them since they're not expecting any sort of budget cuts there. But it's important for us, what we're going to be looking for when Republicans bring up these bills is how much funding do they provide to these subcommittees above FY22 levels? Because remember, they said they want to keep funding overall at that standard, but that means that every dollar that they spend going above FY22 means even deeper cuts to HUD programs, USDA housing programs, and other domestic priorities. So we're going to keep an eye out for that as well. I don't think we're going to see a THUD bill until maybe June of next month. Those bills are going to get a lot harder. It's hard to imagine even House Republicans voting on bills that cut HUD's budget by such a huge amount. It's politically a lot easier to call for budget cuts when you don't actually have to put pen to paper and point out which programs are going to be cut. So that's something that we're going to be closely monitoring. We'll let you know when we need to take action on that side. The Senate may be working towards trying to reach a bipartisan agreement so they can move their appropriations bills forward. But it sounds like I haven't heard anything about them being close to reaching a deal there or not. Okay, that's a lot of information to take in. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Brooke, who's going to talk with you about how you can take action based on what we shared with you today about the threats that are ahead. Brooke.
Thanks, Sarah. Next slide, please. So to oppose these cuts and urge Congress to invest in housing and homelessness programs at the scale needed, we're launching a 2-week advocacy mobilization called Spring into Action today, May 8th through May 19th. Next slide, please. So this week and next, we invite all of you to spring into action with us by telling Congress that cuts hurt. Though we still have the traditional advocacy actions available like phone calls and emails, we're encouraging advocates to get creative in educating congressional leaders about why affordable housing and homelessness programs are important to you and your community and how these cuts would harm you, your family, your neighbors, and all of that. So some possible activities include creating a visual art piece, writing a haiku or other short poem, recording a video telling your story, or using data and stories that highlight the impact of proposed cuts. For example, one of our tenant leaders, Linda, shared her artwork on the right and gave us permission to share with you all today. She'll be sharing this and other visual art pieces with her members of Congress throughout Spring into Action. And another example comes from our very own Courtney Cooperman on the field team, who wrote the following haiku: affordable homes can't be on the chopping block, tell Congress, #cuts-hurt. Next slide, please. So we have a comprehensive budget advocacy toolkit, which we've shared with you before on this call. It has sample social media language, talking points, and more. And we've updated it just last week for the purposes of spring into action and the current state of where the budget negotiations are. Our storytelling worksheet on the right here is also a great resource, and I'll drop these links in the chat in just a moment. It's also a great resource to get the creative juices flowing if you're having writer's block. And if you're looking for specific numbers in the middle here, the specific numbers that highlight the impact of the proposed cuts in your state, you can use White House fact sheets that are state specific. So let me just quickly drop these. Oh, Elena beat me to it. Thanks, Elena. Next slide, please. And before we get to the action part, it's worth noting that we totally get that many of you may feel like our advocacy disappears into a black hole without knowing if it's having an impact. So even though it might not always be obvious, your efforts really do make a difference. And we have some tips to make sure that your social media advocacy has the maximum possible impact. There's brand new research from the Congressional Management Foundation, which shows that 78% of congressional offices say that grassroots social media campaigns have an influence on their decision-making when they're undecided on an issue. And offices are most likely to take social media into account when four conditions are met. First, the member of Congress should be tagged in the post. The office won't see your post unless you tag them. Second, the social media comes from constituents, and the more constituents that post, the bigger an impact it has. Make sure you identify that you're from the district somewhere in your post, otherwise your message will have less weight. And of course, encourage your friends, neighbors, and family in your area to post too. Third, many offices will give greater weight to your opinion if you show an affiliation with the group. So it's helpful if you can tag NLIHC or mention a local group you're a member of. Finally, offices are most likely to take notice of similar messages when they're coming within a concentrated time period. And that's why we're encouraging you to post for Spring into Action within the 2-week period of May 8th through 19th. Next slide, please. So let's say you have your haiku written, your visual laid out, or your video recorded. Now it's time to share with your members of Congress, putting these best practices into action. So you can post your activity on social media this week and next using the hashtags #CutsHurt and Spring into Action, noting that you're a constituent, and be sure to tag your member of Congress and NLIHC. You can also submit written messages to your members of Congress through our Legislative Action Center using the QR code on the right here, or the link below it. And I'll share it again on the next slide. If you have any questions, you can also reach out to us at outreach@nlihc.org. Next slide, please. And so to get the ball rolling for this 2-week campaign, we're going to spring into action together right now. And for the next 5 minutes, we're going to individually workshop our first action. You can share your ideas in the chat or ask questions using the Q&A feature, and I'll read out some of them as we go. This can be as simple as sending some pre-populated tweets through the link that Elena just shared. Just click the bird icon, the tweet icon at that link, or you can go out on your own and start, writing haikus or what have you. Just make sure, like I said, to tag your members of Congress and NLIHC and use the hashtags. At 5 till we will come back together for Sarah to close us out. And I will just say that if you're feeling like, whoa, that I'm not creative, I don't know how to do this, I am not a writer, I am definitely not a poet. And in the 5 minutes before this call, I started workshopping, and it just like using the advocacy toolkit that Elena shared a link to, and some of that messaging, and they actually did start flowing. So I encourage you all to do your best and share thoughts as they come to you. Okay, 5 till, we'll come right back. All right, well, you all are still working away. I'm going to read a couple that came through the chat here. Lindsay from our team said, my 6-year-old daughter and I are discussed housing affordability and homelessness in our community, that many families in New York need some help to pay for their homes, and how it's important to use our voices to make change. I shared her drawing of our home and thoughts on Twitter this morning, so you can click that link to Lindsay's tweet. Definitely encourage you to check that out. Gabby from our team wrote, roses are red, violets are blue, hashtag cuts hurt me and you too. That's great. One I wrote that I shared in the chat just before the call today is hashtag cuts hurt families, fund thriving communities, and help them stay hashtag housed. We have a great question in the Q&A box. Are there flyers for Spring into Action we can put up around neighborhoods? I don't think we do, but we could certainly, we'll have an e-blast going out tomorrow that you could certainly pull from and throw into a flyer, or if you would like some help with that, you can feel free to reach out to me and we can work together on that. Sydney from our team wrote, housing is for all, cuts are exclusionary, keep it inclusive. That's great. And Sarah, while people continue to write, Ali had a question in the chat as well. Do we have a detailed target list of both of the kind of generic groups of targets that you listed?
Yeah, we can definitely share that in the follow-up email. We've put that together for internal purposes at LHC, but there's no harm in sharing that with all of you guys so that you have a better sense of which members of Congress are most critical for you to reach out to. I have to say, I love the photo that Lindsay shared of the drawing from her daughter. I think it's that sort of heartfelt, participation from the next generation that's really going to move the dial here. So appreciate Lindsay, getting a young advocate ready for the fight ahead.
Absolutely. Brian Jackson shared in the chat, listen to the cries as the children on the streets fall between the cracks. Thanks for sharing, Brian. That's great. And Pat Davis shared, these are great. So some great encouragement for folks. And then Lindsay also shared another haiku and how emphasizing how much fun we've been having with this. Here's hers about the Fair Housing Improvement Act, protects people from housing discrimination when using vouchers. That's great. One other that I wrote that I will just read out as folks are wrapping up: to end homelessness, provide housing investments, and say no to cuts. And I encourage you all to continue sharing those in the chat, and most of all, share them on social media with your members of Congress, because that's the most important piece here, is that they are getting the message of how cuts would hurt you, your family, and your communities. And with that, we're at 5 till. So I just want to thank you all for participating in that unique moment in our national call where we took a moment to workshop together. I know at least our team has had a lot of fun with this so far, and we hope you do too. And we hope that you'll continue to participate this week and next. Just really keep that drum beating throughout that time period, since, like Sarah said, this is a really important time. So with that, I'll turn it back to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Brooke. I appreciate it. I hope I see everybody participating on social media in our Spring into Action campaign. And with that, we will end today's call and we will see you guys all in 2 weeks. Thanks for joining.